Andrew O'Shaughnessy is a professor in the Department of History, but mostly he's extremely busy because he's also the Saunders director of the Robert H. Smith International Center Jefferson Studies at Monticello. And I think a few weeks ago, or months ago, I guess at this point, we had a wonderful conference that he set up with others at Monticello that I think was really spectacular. Sandy gave some comments there too that day. But I concluded, gee, we've got to get this gentleman to speak to us, and happily he agreed to do that. He's from the UK, actually East Anglia, and got his BA, MA, and Doctor of Philosophy at Oxford, which for being near Cambridge is called the other place. But at any event, his most recent book was about the men who lost America, British leadership, the American Revolution, and the fate of the empire. It was published a few years ago by Yale University Press. It was very, very well received. In fact, I'll have to admit I haven't read the book yet, but I've read the reviews, and I'm going to read the book because the reviews are terrific. It's interesting. I had the joy of spending 5 years on the faculty at Cambridge around 2000, and one of my interesting events was a night at High Table at Clare College at Cambridge, which was founded in 1326. And in the dining room, they had these portraits around. And two of the people I recognized, one was George Cornwallis, and the other was Townshend of the Townshend Act, of the Stamp Act. I didn't say much about it. I just had a very lovely dinner. But at any event, that is an area that he's really written a lot about. And then he's also the author of An Empire Divided, the American Revolution and the British Caribbean. Fellow of the Royal Historical Society, has been speaking around the country and on a lot of things, as well as involved in journals, scholarly journals as well. So I think we're going to be in for a genuine treat tonight. And with that, I'll turn the floor over to you, Andrew, and thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. Well, I want to thank Don Detmer for the invitation, and also Philander Johnson and the staff of the Colonnade Club. This was actually the last place that Jefferson visited on his very final visit to the university. And he came in here where they were storing books that were going to go to the rotunda, and he personally opened a lot of the boxes. And one of the themes this evening will be the extent to which Jefferson was involved in every aspect of the implementation of creating this university. And he opened the boxes, and in the final boxes that he opened were copies of Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. This seems almost supernatural in itself, because the first volume of that came out in 1776. And a lot of British people regarded it as a bad omen of what was going to happen to the British Empire. But when Jefferson opened the box, he found that the name of Gibbon was spelt with an E on the end. And he said, this is incorrect, send it back to the toolers. So we are literally on hallowed ground. Now, I'm currently writing a book about Jefferson's founding of the university. It has the same title as the title of this lecture. My reason for starting this book was not really the bicentenary, although I was very aware of that. But my main reason was that we always think of Jefferson as a libertarian and as essentially anti-government. And yet here was a case where Jefferson was advocating vastly expanding the role of government. We should remember in the 18th century that government was largely confined to just waging war and defense. It didn't really have a social role. And yet Jefferson was putting forward the case for having a public system of education in Virginia as early as the American Revolution. So that was partly what interested me. The other theme that interested me was the sheer creativity of his ideas for the university. I read a book by Gary Wills, which I suspect many read here, Mr. Jefferson's University, and there was enough in that book really to intrigue me about Jefferson's ideas of the curriculum. I remember my favorite story was his plan for the rotunda, in which he was going to have essentially a planetarium at the top of the rotunda, and the professor would be seated in a saddle with stirrups at the end of a mechanical device which would allow him to literally use this as a classroom, the ultimate visual aid. Probably a very dangerous undertaking given these planters' children who were the students at the time, but it just seemed to me, just that little detail, remarkable of the way he was thinking about this university and his willingness to rethink. And it's very important because we are, at the moment, the whole idea of the university is being questioned, what we do in higher education. And using Jefferson's ideas is still, I think, a way to rethink and to consider anew, because just like starting the country, he was literally had a tabula rasa to think about what a university should be and what we should be doing in it. Now, I have to say from the outset that there were limitations to his vision, which I've become very aware of based on the current literature. Like the Declaration of Independence, the reality did not always lead, it was not always up to the actual vision. And most modern commentators have really dwelt on the limitations. For example, Jefferson wanted to create a university which was free. That was his ultimate goal, and when he couldn't get that, he wanted scholarships for the poor, but it ended up being the most expensive university in America. It was competing with Harvard in terms of the price. Jefferson had wanted to create a public school system, and yet ultimately the cost of this university made a public school system impossible. It was a trade-off. Eventually, he gave up on the public school system and spent much of the state money which was available for education on the university itself. He talked about the illimitable freedom of the human mind, and yet he was very dogmatic about how politics and how law should be taught. Now, I actually think that this has been overstressed, and if I don't get time to mention it in the talk, please feel free to ask me in the questions why I think that's true. And one of the great criticisms made currently is the presence of slavery at the university and the building of the university, but the fact that so many university alumni either fought for the Confederacy or actually senior members of the cabinet of the Confederacy. Nothing could be more damning than the university's own report on slavery, and I'm going to quote some of it. He believed that a Southern institution was necessary to protect the sons of the South from abolitionist teachings in the North. So this point's made several times, that Jefferson's motive in founding the university was to protect slavery. Jefferson believed it was important to educate Virginians and other Southerners in an institution that understood and ultimately supported slavery. In fact, Jefferson's own world was so intimately connected with slavery that he likely could not imagine a different reality, which is not the case. And Jefferson, in fact, imagined an America free of slavery. The university that grew after Jefferson's death in July 1826 in many ways fulfilled his vision in creating a Southern pro-slavery Ivy League school. Now, I have to say the report is commendable in dealing with the subjects of slavery and race. The university would be one of the last to really become fully integrated. It has a lot of very good information, but my aim this evening is actually to argue that Jefferson's ideas about education and about this university were as revolutionary as all the other accomplishments that he listed on his tombstone. And the other two, of course, were the Declaration of Independence and the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. I want to argue that it was a huge personal achievement, and I want to suggest that his motives in founding the university were far broader. I understand how the Slavery Commission made that claim, but I think it's very misleading that his aims were far broader, and that he first talks about establishing a university in 1800 to Joseph Priestley, when the issue of slavery was not at the forefront of American politics. And finally, given the time, so I'm going to have to be brief, I want to suggest what was really unique about this university, and that I don't think gets stressed nearly enough in the literature. The danger of all institutional histories is they tend to be very inward-looking, and they don't look at other universities in the same period and what was going on in Europe and what was going on in America at the time. Let me begin by stressing this was a huge personal achievement. Jefferson undertook the task of creating this university between the ages of 73 and 83, ages when most of us consider a pleasant, relaxed retirement, a period in which he suffered ill health, a period in which he found it increasingly difficult to write. And yet, as the son of the surveyor, he surveyed the actual land on which the university would be. As a former lawyer, he wrote all of the bills for the university, despite his difficulty in writing. As a politician, he brilliantly managed, and I will talk a little bit about this, the strategy of getting this through the legislature at a time when the average politician was no keener on spending money on education than they are today. But what was remarkable is he did this during one of the most serious financial crises in Virginia history, with the great crash of 1819, which we think of as the Bicentennial, the year that the bill goes through, but it was also the worst financial crash of the 19th century. And yet, he engaged in one of the most expensive public building projects of any time previously in American history. The only parallel that I can think of is the building of Washington, D.C., and it's no coincidence that he used people like Benjamin Latrobe and William Thornton, who were concurrently engaged in building Washington, D.C. He was, of course, the architect of the university, admittedly advised by Latrobe and Thornton. He was the mind behind it. He created the curriculum. He chose books for the library. And he chose the faculty with assistance in all cases, but ultimately the decision was his. He was even the secretary of the Board of Visitors, which was rather smart politically. He wrote the minutes of the board. And furthermore, he invited every Sunday evening every student back to Monticello for dinner, including when the Marquis de Lafayette visited. He invited students to attend that. I was speaking at the Chicago Athletic Club. One of our donors came up to me and he brought the invitation to a student, which I intend to use as an illustration, to come to join a dinner with the Marquis de Lafayette. He also invited all the faculty during weekdays and in fact had them regularly rotated and had them back many, many times. In fact, his grandchildren complained that they were being neglected because they weren't seeing Granddad, or Grandpapa as they called him. He was so busy with this project. And it also helped that he had one of the great networks, the Enlightenment, and he was able to consult with the leading thinkers of the period. He consulted a lot with Joseph Priestley, who we see as really the father of oxygen, the chemist, and also the father of Unitarianism. It was Priestley to whom he spoke first about his ideas for a University of Virginia in 1800. The Abbé Carreras of Portugal, really the leading Portuguese Enlightenment thinker who Jefferson essentially wanted to reside permanently at Monticello. Alex von Humboldt, who was the father of public education in Prussia. Thomas Cooper, who was a disciple of Priestley and another major Unitarian, but one of the great intellects in America at the time, who later went on to be president of the University of South Carolina, and Dupont de Nemours, who put forward a plan for public education in America, and with whom Jefferson was in regular correspondence. He never, as with all of Jefferson's ideas, including architecture, he never copied these people, but he borrowed aspects of their ideas. But you can never show anywhere where Jefferson replicates their ideas. Now, I said that Jefferson did not found this university first and foremost to protect slavery or to explain slavery. In fact, his thinking about the university went back to the American Revolution. And it was really, the university was just the apex of a much broader educational vision. Really, the first important idea that he put forward was in 1779, a plan for the general diffusion of knowledge in Virginia. And it was part of a series of codes for the revision of laws and the improvement of Virginia, since he was always concerned about the progress and making life better in the state. I find this plan remarkable because it's putting forward the idea of a public education system. Now, admittedly, today we'd say it was elitist. He wanted a free education for children, both boys and girls, which was remarkable. Although it's not said explicitly, we're assuming it was white children and free children, but nevertheless, the majority of people in the state would get a basic education. And his main reason for doing this, and indeed for having a university, is that he felt people needed to understand why republics had failed in the past and how to protect this very experimental system of government. The British thought it would fail, so did everyone else. Every republic in the past has essentially failed, and Jefferson felt the only way to protect it was to have an educated citizenry who could hold the government accountable, and also to have a political elite who understood that their role was to put their own self-interest aside and to serve the people. That would be the role of the university, to educate the elite, and the schools would educate the great mass of people. It was an elitist system because only the best and brightest would go on to grammar schools, and then only the very elite would go on to university, and they would all be men. But it was remarkable because there was no public school system anywhere in the world. The places that came closest to it were Scotland and New England, and that's largely thanks to the influence of Presbyterians and Congregationalists who wanted children to be able to read the Bible, whereas Jefferson wanted them to be able to read history and to learn from the past. And I can't resist saying that as a historian, that he thought that should be first and foremost part of their basic education, admittedly teaching history under reading. The first place to actually decree a public education system, and indeed all the places that experimented with the idea in Europe, were not republics, but autocracies. Russia was the first to decree, the Tsarina of Russia, that there should be a public education system, followed by Austria, followed by Prussia. But these were decrees, and they didn't bring about a public education system. But Prussia was the most successful. But it really wasn't until the early 19th century that started to be realized. And there's one fundamental difference between these autocracies in America. In the autocracies, they wanted to educate people to serve the state and to create an obedient public, really to reinforce the autocratic system. In America, Jefferson's ideas were the opposite. It was to keep the government accountable and to prevent tyranny. And Jefferson also put forward a bill in 1779 to reform William and Mary. That was his first idea for a state university, to improve what we already had. And he realized some of his aims. He wanted to make the curriculum of William and Mary more modern, more relevant, more vocational. And he wanted to make it less religious. William and Mary was set up, the second university in America, although called college, and we can talk about the differences between college and university. It was set up to train Anglican clergy. And Jefferson specifically wanted a more secularized curriculum, and one that was non-denominational and free, really, of any religious interference. He was unable, really, to reform William and Mary. He went away, of course, to Paris after the American Revolution as ambassador to France. While he was there, he never lost interest in this system. He signed on and contributed to a French scheme to create an academy in Richmond, which would have lots of sub-branches elsewhere in America and a headquarters in Paris. That was scotched by the French Revolution. In 1794, once he was back in America, he saw a marvelous opportunity with revolution in Europe to transplant the entire University of Geneva to America. This was the top university in Europe at the time that was being affected by revolution and instability in Europe. He wanted to bring the entire faculty to America. He supported George Washington's ideas for a national university, so it didn't necessarily have to be in Virginia. He just felt it was essential that you educate the elite who are going to be the senior politicians, the leaders in America, and educate them to serve a republic. He supported that. While he was president, he created West Point. This is not his only university or academy. And according to one of the current faculty at West Point, he really wanted West Point ultimately to be part of a national university. Certainly, while president, he tried to get an amendment to the Constitution for a national university. And he also thought that federal government should be involved in funding science, which is interesting because most of his proposals for education were at the state level. So this was long before the issue of slavery came to the forefront, that he believed most of his ideas had already been settled as to what a university should be and the need for public education. After his retirement, and throughout this period he'd been corresponding with people, after his retirement he started to pursue this matter more urgently. And some people have suggested that his urgency was because of the issue of slavery. Certainly in 1819 you have the Missouri crisis, which is the first great crisis between the North and South that involves slavery. But Jefferson really starts to push for the university, you could say as early as 1814, when he gets onto the board of the Albemarle Academy, a non-existent institution that was really creating a high school. But it's quite clear Jefferson had no interest in a high school at the time, because he draws a plan up for the Albemarle Academy that is largely now used to show his plan for the University of Virginia. The lawn is there, the symmetric layout of, it's somewhat simpler buildings, but it looks awfully like the University of Virginia, and certainly something too grand to be a high school. 2 years later, he manages to get that board to dissolve itself, and he alone would continue as a member of that board and to call it Central College. That's very critical, because just the name Central was going to be key to the argument that he made for establishing a university. And I realize I'm going over some ground that other lecturers may have referred to, but during the period it was Central College, he began a very vigorous and ambitious building campaign that included this building, the laying of the foundation stone. And the reason for his urgency and determination is he wanted to make the case that this should be the University of Virginia. He, of course, successfully managed to persuade the state to create the Rockfish Gap Commission. What stands out, and thanks to our editors of the Jefferson papers and Monticello, the retirement papers, who are editing all of the papers related to the founding of the university, we realized that many of the members of that commission were local. They were not statewide. We realized, too, that Jefferson actually wrote the draft of the commission report before the commission met. That has been known previously, but he also changed his draft several times, and that, I think, is new. He realized some arguments didn't work well, like the idea that the water's better here in Charlottesville than in Stanton and elsewhere. He dropped that. He retained his argument that it was the center of the white population, but he deliberately didn't publish the figures, whereas Joseph Cabell, who became his great ally in the assembly in creating the university, Cabell did publish the figures, and people immediately quibbled with them because there was clearly something seriously wrong with the figures. He'd had to count free blacks, for example, which seemed a little bizarre in terms of his argument. Jefferson did have to give way on some items during the Rockfish Gap, especially his idea that there'd be no place on campus for religious meetings. He had to agree to a room in the rotunda, but he pushed back against that for the rest of his life, and no religious meeting occurred here during his lifetime. What strikes me is the brilliance of his political strategy to make this happen, from which we can all learn for those of us who still want to promote public education and universities. He met considerable opposition. One was based on location. Other places like Richmond and Stanton wanted to be the main locations. Religious groups opposed him, especially the Presbyterians in the Valley. They thought it was an atheist idea. But as important was simply the cost. People couldn't believe the cost. And Jefferson did all of the estimates. He even estimated how many bricks each pavilion would need. And he got the bricks right, but the money wrong. And always he underestimated the actual cost. And he left the rotunda, the most expensive building, to the end. And the Richmond Inquirer, which was used largely by his opponents, published an anonymous article. And they said they'd been to see this cheerful old man who's chuckling up at Monticello. And he was joking, saying, it's in for a penny, in for a pound. You know, once they've signed off on these other projects, they can't possibly stint on the rotunda. They basically bought in, and they have to accept the cost. It is remarkable. I mean, that may be apocryphal. I mean, it was in the paper. It may be apocryphal and the meeting actually took place, but it is remarkable how consistently he underestimated the actual cost by tens of thousands of pounds. And then there was competition, and very valid competition. William and Mary fought to the bitter end, right through the passing of the bill to the first year of students, that they should be the main campus. But the college of Washington College had an even better claim. It had a wonderful endowment, and it had a lot of promises. They'd undertaken development campaigns, as we would regard them today, and raised money. It was a very popular location. Washington himself had given its blessing, and yet that was turned down as well. What is remarkable is how Jefferson outmaneuvered the opposition. Just as he'd done in the 1790s, he used third parties. He used Cabell as his representative. Rather than James Madison in Congress, he got Cabell. He worked on getting the right people elected and persuading people not to resign and not to retire. He found wonderful allies, and I always think it's the real sign of leadership, who you choose and the people you work under. Washington was very gifted in this respect, but beside Joseph Cabell, Francis Walker Gilmer, who he regards as the most brilliant young man in Virginia, he sent him to Europe to choose faculty. He used celebrity. And to have James Madison, James Monroe, a sitting and two past presidents dig your foundation stone was marvelous propaganda. It's a place called Central College, not the University of Virginia. He put articles in the newspapers. Jefferson always understood the press and the importance of the press. It was one of the real advantages the Republicans had had over the Federalists during the 1790s. And he was smart, too, at selecting the board members, including the Rockfish Gap Commission, but also the Board of Visitors. What I want to end up with is just talking briefly about what was so distinctive about his vision and how it was really unique in America. And the reason that that's not fully appreciated is that either what was unique has become commonplace throughout America, or what was unique has ceased to be true in Virginia. We've done away with some of the Jeffersonian innovations. One is the elective curriculum. There was no other system like it in America at the time, where students could choose their own courses and mix and match. My father taught in America at Columbia University. He was less impressed by the system, and it does have its critics. He called it the smorgasbord approach to education. But the fact is, it is one of the defining characteristics of American education. It was adopted, especially in the South, by people who'd been here, graduates of the University of Virginia. His idea of public education. Admittedly, he wanted people who could pay to pay, so you might say it's not a truly public education system, but to have scholarships and the recognition that students deserve this on merit, and the recognition that over generations, people who were part of the elite would be downwardly mobile, and that there were bright, able people to come from the bottom. There is a meritocratic understanding. Admittedly, it excluded women, it excluded free blacks and slaves, a majority of the population, but in terms of the time period, that was truly revolutionary. His emphasis on a vocational education. This was the first university to teach economics, and his belief in a practical education. However, I don't want to give you the idea that he was an early advocate of STEM, because he regarded one of the most essential subjects as being Anglo-Saxon, and I can explain that in the question and answer, but he thought that was essential. And he also believed modern languages, and he was well aware that Greek and Latin were beginning to decline in popularity in Europe, but he still believed that the American universities should retain them. And he said, I really am glad that that was part of my education system. One of the most revolutionary ideas, and one I think the university should really tout, is the separation of church and state. If you want to know how Jefferson wanted that to be realized, look at the University of Virginia. There would be no department of theology. There would be no chapel. This was the first university to have a Jewish professor, to have Catholics both as professors and students, and a much broader religious toleration than universities in the North. The method of governance was revolutionary, of not having a president and having faculty and a rotating chair largely making the decisions. It's one of the first universities, the first in America, really to choose faculty on the basis of real merit and a claim to international reputation. Jefferson actually wanted to recruit within America and tried at Harvard, people like George Tickner at Harvard. When he couldn't get them, he went to Europe. But the point is that the people he was appointing were regarded as such major acquisitions that they would be reported in the Connecticut newspapers. It was a big deal. He was looking for academic stars. And incidentally, this university paid the highest salaries in America other than South Carolina. I realize that has changed as well. His thinking of pedagogy was different, that he didn't want rote learning and simply lectures that were read out. What he was really looking for was the kind of relationship that he had had with William Small and George Wythe, where they were, much like an Oxford tutorial, engaged in real conversations with their academic. Now, you've got Bob Gibson coming to speak to you about medicine at the early university. We really need someone like him to look at all of the departments, because what he's going to be showing is how innovative the original medicine curriculum was here. I believe that was true of most of the other fields as well. He's very funny because he points out how Jefferson believed that the only medicine that should be practiced was based on empirical evidence. He was not in favor of theory, interestingly, and not in favor of speculation, and as being as least intrusive as possible. And Bob always ends by reminding us the name of the first medical journal, The Lancet, which sums up the ideas at the time. I would say that this was perhaps, according to the author of a study of the first public universities, this was one of two of the first real public universities. Now, William and Mary will say it was public, and in fact, the distinction between public and private made almost no sense in the 18th century. There were a mixture of public and private. Dartmouth was the first in 1831 to bring a case with the Supreme Court arguing that it was a private university. But the fact is, Harvard was still trying to get public money until the Civil War, that places like William and Mary could have gone either way. What was distinctive about the University of Virginia and the University of South Carolina was that they were the first to receive public money annually. North Carolina, also in the South, has the earliest charter for a public university. And I would advance Jefferson's idea of meritocracy as also being distinctive. In fact, I think we have to be careful not to read history backwards. There was a small window in the late 18th and early 19th century when the South potentially could have given a lead to education. Remember, the northern colleges, what we call the Ivy League today, were largely producing church ministers or lawyers. The point about places like South Carolina, North Carolina, and the University of Transylvania, they were much more tolerant on religious matters. Some would say because of slavery and the need for white egalitarianism. They were public universities. They emphasized vocation. And they also had the honor systems among the students. It was not introduced during Jefferson's time, but this was another distinctive feature of the Jefferson's ideas, which in many ways is picked up by the honor system, that instead of having corporal punishment for students, which still existed in a lot of universities, that the students to a large extent be self-governing. Again, it matches his political philosophy, and there are similar versions of that throughout the South. Thank you very much. Yes.
As well as sharing with us tonight.
Excellent. Well, you know, it really helps to talk about a book before it's written, and these question answers, because nothing is yet written in stone. So if you want to push back or question, it gives me an opportunity to think about what it is I'm saying in the book. It's going to be quite a short book, almost as Gary Wills by request of the University Press, but in some ways I'm quite glad about that because it allows me not to get too entrapped in detail, which is always the temptation of historians, but to make the key points.
Well, we eagerly anticipate.
Yes, excellent.
And
yes.
I think we have people who are more than happy to push back. Let's open the floor for questions and comments. Over here, and then over there.
I'll let Don do the right.
No, go ahead.
Yes, okay. Well, we'll start there and then here. Right.
On the subject of STEM, you know that there are charcoal ovens in the rotunda.
Yes.
And the expansion of that, which has been called a chemistry lab.
Yes.
And that would imply that he at least had an open mind towards STEM.
It's more than an open mind. He felt that one of the key areas to be, and that was not really being taught in northern schools or really at Oxford and Cambridge, was to really give a much higher profile to the sciences. In many ways, the Enlightenment is an outgrowth of the scientific revolution of the 17th century, and Jefferson especially championed science. He was always interested in how you improve people's everyday life. So although he had this higher ambition in terms of what education could do for the state, it was also about progress and improving and making life easier. And no one loved gadgets more than Jefferson, or applying learning in such a way, whether it be medicine or whatever, to make people's lives improvable. So I would certainly, while he did emphasize Anglo-Saxon modern languages, history, and a very rounded curriculum, there's no doubt for him the core was the sciences.
Thank you.
Andrew, could you give us a little more in-depth perspective on the involvement of Joseph Cabell in
Yes.
this whole process, specifically in terms of getting the university approved and also getting it located here in Charlottesville?
Cabell was instrumental, and Jefferson obviously could not be there present in the legislature itself. Cabell was not well. He didn't entirely share Jefferson's political views. And he several times said, "I've had enough. I'm stepping down the next session." And this is where, of course, Jefferson's political skills and, frankly, a manipulator come into play, because he kept persuading. And he said, "You know, I'm elderly, I'm frail. You know, I can't, will probably not live to see this happen. You know, I'm relying on you." I mean, this sort of straight emotional blackmail. But Cabell was remarkable in the way he produced the votes. Every so often he felt daunted and would push back at Jefferson, say, "This is too much. The cost of the rotunda is never going to get accepted." But Jefferson made few concessions, and Cabell managed to get it through. And there were those in the legislature who obviously felt a public school system was more important than a university. And Jefferson never gave up on the public school system. He introduced a bill for it in 1817, which is very like his bill of 1779. But the point was that Jefferson realized the money available for a public school system was inadequate. And I think by that point, and this is where the Missouri crisis and other things may have played in, he was worried that the leadership of the country was not ready. In terms of abolition, and this is how the university report went where it did, yes, he believed it should be decided by the states. He sided with the South in the Missouri crisis, but not to perpetuate slavery. He'd always been a lifelong abolitionist. This was a man who talked about a deplorable entanglement. He called slavery an abomination. His argument was that the next generation of leaders should figure this out, and that besides, slavery was going to disappear as people spread out westward. It would become more diffuse and it would go. And Jefferson was always an eternal optimist, not least his belief in the people. So the fact that his education bill never got through in 1779 never made him give up. He always argued the people will ultimately get it right, much more so than a small coterie of ambitious leaders.
Yes, back.
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I just read an essay by Alan Taylor,
Yes.
who said that there's a line in there. It says that the university was founded to defend a way of life that included slavery.
Yes.
So I want to pick up on the point you made, maybe from the Slavery Commission report. If it wasn't the only reason, was it one of the reasons?
Well, his point was he wanted a Southern university, but there were so many other issues. And Jefferson is sometimes regarded as the author of nullification because he wrote the Kentucky Resolves along with James Madison, the Virginia Resolves, but those weren't about slavery. They were about the Alien and Sedition Acts passed by the Federalists. And my argument, and Alan will say, oh, well, Jefferson wasn't willing to risk his political capital. It would have killed his political capital if he'd taken on slavery. And he denounced it publicly in Notes on the State of Virginia that remained in publication throughout his life. There was one member of his generation, Robert Carter, who did what we all think you should do today, and he emancipated all his slaves. Carter was forced into, basically ostracized and forced to live in Annapolis. Jefferson couldn't have been president. He couldn't have held any of the roles, governor of Virginia, and he couldn't have founded the University of Virginia if he'd taken a very public opposition to slavery. What I find poor is that there were so many other issues. And Jefferson was fearful of Federalists, Northern Federalists, because he believed they still believed in monarchy and aristocracy, and he believed that passionately. He also believed they were quite willing to let America become a neo-colonial satellite of Britain. But there were other issues. I mean, I'm the first to argue that by the time of the Civil War, state rights had just become a cover for slavery. That was not true in 1819. The tariff was at an all-time high. The tariff benefited the North, import duties, but it hurt the South, which relied a great deal on imports and did most of its trade with Europe. But more importantly was the financial system, the Northern financial system of banks and currency. Jefferson despised it. And the crash of 1819, which he believed had killed his own finances and led to his bankruptcy, he blamed on that Northern financial system. So a lot of issues besides slavery. The only way slavery is involved is that he did feel that Northern abolitionists shouldn't force it on the South, that the South had to make the decision as states because he felt that ultimately it risked the Union. And the Union and the Republican system were more important than whether slavery existed or not, because to protect the Republican system was ultimately the solution to slavery in America and to everything else. If you sacrificed that union and the Republican system, which he saw increasingly as unique to America, you sacrificed everything.
Let's do we have two more questions and then we'll go informal.
Right, yes.
I read something recently that suggested that perhaps Jefferson was something of a modern day prophet. Was wondering, in your scholar, have you ever come across anything that suggested that maybe he got a vision of the university?
Well, I mean, it's very prescient. I think historians have a problem today as to the extent to which he's a stepping stone to the present, and he's very much a product of his own time. And why should we really focus just on Jefferson when we talk about slavery, when it was a national problem? Everyone was involved in it. I mean, in terms of universities, there was slavery at every university in the South. What distinguished the University of Virginia is Jefferson had a rule that the students should not have their own slaves, and that remained in force till the Civil War. Admittedly, it was breached at times, but that was a distinguishing feature. But of course, naturally, as intellectuals, we'd love to think he could transcend his own time period, because he did in many ways on so many subjects. But this is a transitionary period from a very elitist Republican system to a much more democratic system. Yes?
As I understand it, he started this university with 5 faculty members, all of which were from Europe, one of which was a Scottish physician.
Yes, Robert Douglinson. But it was 8 ultimately, 8 faculty members.
But how did he decide on, one was an engineer, how did he decide on the 5 fields of study that ultimately constituted those 5?
So one thing, you want to exclude religion. And so what had been a major subject and was still a major subject in northern universities, Transylvania and North Carolina had experimented with something that was more secularized, but they quickly reverted to a more traditional type of university. And nearly all the universities being set up at the time were largely set up by Presbyterians and were largely religious. And we should always remember that our whole idea of the university and the university system is largely a product of religious foundations. The terminology we use at universities, even the names of degrees, even sometimes the ceremonies of degree services, and even some of the hierarchies like dean or the notion of fellowship, largely come from the Catholic Church.
I think our guest has a question, and we'll wrap it up after. I think, did you start to raise a question?
Well, we've got one from the lady at the back.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Good.
I can raise the question.
Yes.
You've read Clemens' History of the University of Virginia.
Whose?
Clemens, for whom the library.
Yes, yes.
When I read that years ago, my memory is it said Jefferson did not want religion in this university.
Right.
He did not have a chaplain. He did not have a school of religion. He did not have a chapel. That has all drastically changed.
Yes,
Except
yes.
for the chaplain.
But it has to be said, he wanted religion taught as history. And he certainly wanted religious books in the library. I mean, in a way, he was more doctrinaire about that than the teaching of law and politics. But I mean, his great fear was that the university would come under the control of a particular denomination and would be actively proselytizing for that group. I mean, I've always thought it interesting as a way to interpret his statute and the First Amendment, because it's a very practical example of what he meant by the separation of church and state, and it's a pretty drastic separation. He was not, though, opposed to religious groups setting up on the margins of the university, and he was really in favor of a marketplace in which they would compete with each other, and he thought that it would lead to all the students becoming Unitarians. And you know, I said he was optimistic and he got things wrong. Just as he thought slavery would disappear, he also believed everyone would become a Unitarian.
Andrew, thank you for a very
Thank you.
good
Yes.
I will be giving him on your behalf a copy of our painting out there, but I didn't bring it upstairs tonight, so I'll get it to him. But thank you all for coming. And, will you be around?
Yes, absolutely. Anyone wants to talk.